In a great kingdom, a young poor boy was brought before the king in chains one gray morning. He stood in the center of the throne room with iron on his wrists and his head completely up. A senior noble read the accusations aloud, and the throne room listened in heavy silence. The boy spoke in his own defense with a calm, clear voice that did not tremble once. The king raised his hand and silenced the boy before he could finish what he was saying. The sentence was delivered in a cold, commanding voice, and the room accepted it without protest. The boy's expression did not collapse, and he did not beg, and he did not look away. He was led out of the throne room with his back straight and his steps completely steady. The prison cell was small and dark and cold, and the boy sat on the stone floor alone. He sat quietly for a long time, looking at his own hands resting in his lap, saying nothing. Then he called the guard through the bars and asked for a small piece of parchment and a quill. The guard looked at him strangely, but slid the parchment and quill under the bars anyway. The boy sat close to the dim torchlight and began writing slowly and very carefully. He wrote for a long time, and when he finished, he folded the parchment with great precision. He called the guard again and handed the folded parchment through the bars to him. He asked only one thing: that the letter be given to the king after everything was done. The guard took it and looked at it and looked back at the boy and could not speak. The boy nodded once and sat back on the cold stone floor and closed his eyes. The next morning came gray and heavy, and the village square filled with silent people, and the poor boy walked out through the palace doors with his head up and his steps even. He walked through the crowd, and not one person there could look directly at his face. He stopped at the base of the platform steps and looked out over the crowd for a long moment. His eyes were not frightened, and they were not angry, and they were not asking for anything. They were the eyes of someone who had already made their peace with everything completely. The king watched from the high palace window above with a face that showed nothing at all. The boy climbed the stone steps slowly with his back straight and his head held high. He stood on the platform and looked out over the silent crowd one last time. And the expression on his face was one that nobody standing in that square ever forgot. It was not the face of someone who had lost, and it was not the face of someone who was afraid. It was the face of someone who knew something that the rest of them had not yet understood. When it was over, the square was completely silent for a long time, and nobody moved at all. Then the prison guard walked through the palace corridors with the folded parchment in his hand. He entered the throne room and approached the king and held the parchment out without speaking. The king took it slowly and looked at it and unfolded it with the air of a man expecting nothing. His eyes moved across the first lines, and his expression did not change, and then it did. Something in the second line made him sit up straighter and grip the parchment more tightly. He read further, and his hands, which had signed sentences for 20 years, began to tremble. He stood up abruptly from his throne with the parchment still in his hand and walked to the window. He looked down at the empty palace square below and stood there without moving for a long time. And what was written on that small piece of parchment began to do what the boy's voice could not. The letter did not ask for mercy, and it did not speak of injustice, and it made no accusations. It began simply, "By the time you read this, the question of my guilt no longer matters." It said, "I am not writing to change what happened, because what happens cannot always be changed." It said, "I am writing because there are things a kingdom should know that no one alive will say." Line by line, the boy laid out what he had seen in the village streets over years of living in them. He wrote about the noble who had accused him and what that noble did when no one powerful watched. He wrote about the farmers and the broken roads and the taxes and the sick men turned away. He wrote without anger and without bitterness, and every sentence was precise and completely clear. And at the end of the letter he wrote only this: "I forgive the king because he did not know." Those 7 words hit harder than everything that had come before them combined. The king stood at the window holding the letter, and the empty square below stared back at him. He turned and called the senior noble who had brought the accusations and handed him the letter. The noble read it, and the color left his face line by line until he was completely still. He could not speak, and he could not look at the king, and he